And now Iranians hold fresh rallies in several cities to denounce acts of rioting and vandalism during recent protests over fuel price hikes. Demonstrators poured into the streets for a fourth consecutive day in largely spontaneous rallies. They condemned U.S., Israel, and seditionist elements for fueling the unrest and chanted slogans in support of the Islamic establishment. Rallies are held after hooligans and gunmen backed by terrorist organizations infiltrated sporadic protests in some cities over a hike in the price of gasoline last week. Saboteurs attacked security forces and set fire to public and private property. A number of security personnel and some protesters were killed during acts of rioting. Spokesman for the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps, Ramazan Sharif, said U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, as well as some Caspian Sea states had a role in inciting violence in Iran. Joining us now to Irvine, California for more on the story is Alexander Azargan, Professor of International Political Economy and Senior Editor at UWI Analytical Center. Hello, Professor. Pleasure to have you back on Press TV. Your thoughts on these now counter-protests we're seeing in the last few days?
Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be with your global audience. So many things going on with this situation. I'm going to sum it up in a few minutes. First and foremost, the enemies of Iran are going to claim that these protests were put together by the government. The quick reply to that is how could that be done when the internet has been shut down for security reasons? So that's first and foremost. Secondly, at a time in Iran, literally a few days ago, announced that they have found fields that contain 53 billion barrels of oil, adding 1/3 to their 150 barrel capacity would have been upsetting to Washington. And so they obviously chose this occasion to take advantage and awake and alert their sleeper cells in Tehran and other cities, especially other cities, smaller towns, because they know that perhaps the security forces may not be as abundant over there as they are in Tehran. So that's the second thing. Third thing that I have to mention, which is very concerning to us, Daniel, is the fact that this jurisdiction issue, that Iran is going to be under the behavioral, social, political, and economic jurisdiction of Washington, that Washington gets to enact sanctions when Tehran doesn't behave according to its will. And this is a horrible precedent that's being set for the global community. They're going to replicate this elsewhere. That's why we need the other world powers to come to the aid of Iran, at least diplomatically and psychologically, in dispelling this. And another thing is that they take hostage people's legitimate concerns. Certainly gas going up by 300% is detrimental, especially to taxi drivers and others who rely on this for their livelihood. And certainly these are the people who come out in support of the establishment because they're the ones that suffer the most. When you have anarchy and chaos in the streets and people are not out there, decent, good people are not out there creating chaos, then the streets are empty, nobody's traveling, and the taxi drivers first and foremost suffer. So this is something we need to keep in touch. In my assessment, and we have empirical, not circumstantial, but empirical proof that MKO is behind these things operationally. They get support from Mossad and CIA. They are agitators. They go into legitimate protests, and they create all sorts of things. There's videos that we have that Iranian security took of agitators hiding behind walls and in trees, shooting bystanders, and through their medias out in London, especially, a couple of monarchists and MKO, more like monarchist opposition and an anarchist, show those videos and say this is done by the Basijis or the security forces. There's this element of deception, downright deception, and unfortunately some people buy it and blame the whole thing on the establishment. In any country when there's massive chaos and systematic threat, it is completely viable and it's in their protocol to shut the internet. So this is not limited to Iran.
And Alexander, even the onset, there were some legitimate protesters out there, non-violent, protesting the rise in fuel prices. My question to you, and Washington says that its heart goes out to that civilian population that's being affected by inflation and hyperinflation and whatnot. But guess what? 99% of that has to do with direct sanctions that Washington in itself is imposing on the civilian population of Iran.
That's part of it. To be academic and fair and balanced, there's major internal issues in Iran that have to be reformed, and they are. You finally have a right, in my assessment, in my personal opinion, the right person in the judiciary. So that process of cleaning house has started. But yes, the sanctions obviously contribute tremendously into this. Washington and Mr. Trump, they don't give a damn about the regular people and their economic well-being. If their sanctions have proven anything, is to put pressure and tighten the belt around the masses, especially the middle class and the class that's really struggling, the economic class that's really struggling. So this is a propaganda move. It's a psychological operation lie to bring on the regular Iranian on board. And in my assessment and in my experience traveling to Iran and being there for long, extended academic missions, the Iranian people are very alert and awake. They may have problems with the establishment, they may have problems with their economic plight, but they will never, the masses that you are showing in your TV screens, they will never side with Mr. Trump and the establishment in Washington. I call them the party of war. They would never side with them in order to express their frustrations at the current system. And really trying to understand Mr. Trump's behavior and the Treasury Department's very intricate and complicated rules is really equivalent to playing chess with the orangutans. It just doesn't make sense whatsoever. I would like to see other superpowers around the world that Washington tampers in their internal effect, that being Russia and China primarily, to broadcast what's happening in Iran from a fair and balanced perspective. Because as you're aware, there are more than 200. This is the highest per capita ratio in the world. More than 200 anti-Iran media around the world, radio and TV, obviously broadcasted through internet, that spew nothing but negativity and falsehood about Iran. And what we need to do as academics is to teach Iranians, those who sometimes, unfortunately, subscribe to those points of view, academic, objective thinking and critical thinking, and for us to inform them, if I may finish, that they cannot just spread rumors and falsehoods, and they are not. They're learning from these experiences, these protests that seem to happen at least every 6 months. I think this could be a learning experience for the Iranians, and from what I'm seeing, I'm actually impressed.
Always a pleasure to get your perspective there on the program. Alexander Alzagan, Professor of International Political Economy and Senior Editor at UWI Analytical Center, joining us out of Irvine, California.